Damn, it feels good to be a gangster. Damn, it feels good to be a gangster. A real gangsta-ass nigga plays his cards right. A real gangsta-ass...
Welcome, Macabros, to episode 11 of Game of Thrones Rewrite. Subscribe if you haven't already, consider supporting me on Patreon, and brace yourselves for what is perhaps going to be the most audacious and radical episode of this rewrite series so far, as we delve into today's subject, Brynden, the Blackfish, Tully. Originally, like with Stannis, I had no intention of doing a rewrite for Brynden, but given the overwhelming viewer demand to rectify the lackluster off-screen death for one of the most badass motherfuckers of the series, I thought I'd give it a go. But little did I realize that my original intention of giving Brynden a rather short video featuring a slight alteration to his disposition in the show, a shout out to Clive Russell's kick-ass performance, and a redo of his ultimate fate is now to be replaced by potentially the most ambitious and downright risky change of this entire series. But we'll get to that in due time. Let's dive right in and discuss the Blackfish's portrayal in the show compared to in the book. As I said, Clive Russell plays the character to perfection, and a testament to this fact is the fan-favorite status that the Blackfish holds while only being featured in a handful of episodes. We are introduced to the Blackfish far earlier in the books than we are in the show, with both Brynden and Edmure Tully being minor characters in A Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings, and entering the story in a more direct way come A Storm of Swords, which is covered in seasons 3 and 4 of the TV show. And this is fine. Cutting down on minor characters where you can and only featuring them once they become essential to the story is the way to go. As for the Blackfish's personality, Clive Russell portrays the character as generally a bit more crass as he is in the book, but it's a delight to watch, so no complaints there. In addition to his alpha BDE, Clive also does a fantastic job at showing the softer, more empathetic side of the Blackfish. My personal favorite moment demonstrating this is him comforting Catelyn after the death of her father. The only weird-ass change that the writers made was the Blackfish's relationship and overall vibe towards Edmure. The Blackfish in the show seems to fucking hate Edmure. He pwns him during the funeral of Hoster Tully, and then later when Edmure gets chewed out for attacking the stone mill, ruining Robb's plan to draw the mountain into the Riverlands, the Blackfish really shows his palpable disdain for his nephew. In the book, their relationship is far more amicable. Sure, Edmure gets chewed out by him after the stone mill attack as he does in the show, but in the book, it comes off as more frustration rather than just straight up scorn. The Blackfish's aggravation is completely understandable as well, since in the book, it was Tywin himself who Edmure faced off against during the battle, and due to Edmure's actions, it allowed Tywin to flee from the Riverlands in time for him to arrive at and win the battle at the Blackwater. Had Edmure held his position and they were able to successfully draw him into the west and surround him, Tywin would not have been able to make it back to King's Landing, and Stannis Baratheon would have most likely taken over the city. Later on, when the Blackfish is holed up at Riverrun, while the Frey army lays siege and they threaten to execute Edmure, which happens in both the book and in the show, in the book, the Blackfish does not give in to their demands simply due to the fact that he knows the Freys will probably kill Edmure and the Blackfish's men no matter what. But in the show, it kind of comes off as just the Blackfish just not giving a shit about Edmure, so he's all just like, do it, pussy. But perhaps the most egregious change that the writers made in order to portray the Blackfish's disdain for his nephew was the funeral of Hoster Tully. In the show, Edmure tries and fails to ignite his father's funeral pyre with a flaming arrow. Eventually, the Blackfish loses his patience and takes over for him. Now in the book, the same scene plays out, but it's made clear that the reason Edmure misses his shots is because he is still in deep mourning over his father's death. And the Blackfish does take over for him, but only after Edmure hands him the bow after realizing he can't do it. And then after, instead of acting annoyed, the Blackfish is extremely empathetic towards Edmure, saying that he should feel no shame, which in my eyes is far more badass than pwning Edmure like he does in the show, and only adds a richness to the Blackfish's character. It's just such a weird change, and it's even weirder considering that it seems like the main reason the writers made the Blackfish more hostile in general towards Edmure is just because they wanted to make Edmure the biggest bitch in Westeros. Edmure is kind of a fuck up in the book too, but the show really just has him serve as a spineless little bitch with a dunk on me sign on his back. The funeral scene being the most clear example of this, but it's not the only one. Later on in the series, when Jaime attempts to settle the siege of Riverrun, he convinces Edmure to surrender the castle, which also happens in the book. But as I mentioned in Jaime's video, in the book it is pretty much spelled out that Edmure agrees to do this simply because it is the only way to ensure any of his comrades and his wife and child escaping with their lives. And when Edmure does surrender the castle, he facilitates the escape of the Blackfish. More on that later. In the show, once again, the writers just sort of frame Edmure's surrender of the castle as him doing so just due to the fact that he is a spineless little pussy, and they omit him helping his uncle escape, I guess as an additional fuck you to Edmure. God, I feel like I've kind of reared off a bit on straight up shitting all over D&D, as I felt it was getting a bit monotonous, but like shit, dude, imagine taking a scene demonstrating a son's mourning over his father's death and his uncle's empathy towards him, and just turning it into a short scene establishing how much of a Eugene he is. I know I'm talking a lot about Edmure, but fuck, the writers really wanted to fuck his shit up. As I said, Edmure kind of sucks in the book as well, but frankly, he doesn't deserve the hatred that the showrunners seem to hold for him. Hell, he doesn't even deserve some of the shit he takes in the book. During the scene where he gets roasted by Robb and his uncle after the stone mill incident, he is chastised for taking it upon himself to lead an assault against the mountain, or Tywin in the book. But like, in both the show and in the book, why the fuck didn't Robb let Edmure in on his plan? Like, I understand Edmure was too impulsive and should have just done what he was told to do, but had Robb let Edmure in on his strategy, Edmure obviously would have followed along. Reminds me of another Stark not letting key people in on a plan. It's also even more of a dick move on Robb's part, seeing as Robb chews Edmure out for not following his orders and doing what he was supposed to do. And looking at Robb's track record of doing stupid shit that fucks up his war plans, yeah, I don't think Robb should really be holding the high ground here. Anyway, that's all I really have in regards to my comments on the Blackfish's personality. Sure, there are changes here and there, but they aren't all that major or shift his character in any significant way. The main gripe that most had with his showrun was the conclusion of his arc, what with a pitiful off-screen death. People were just as pissed about Barristan's death, but at least we saw him go out kicking some ass. But in regards to his finale as it exists in the show, I mean, I guess it really is the only resolution that could have happened. I guess they could have had the Blackfish escape and meet up with Jon and Sansa after they take Winterfell, but that'd be a bit underwhelming. Also, it's pretty fitting with his character that the Blackfish went out swinging. Now, in the book, the Blackfish does escape with the help of Edmure, and he has not been seen since the end of A Feast for Crows. As for his potential whereabouts, well, we'll discuss that in a bit. So anyway, backing up a bit to what I have mentioned before, I originally had planned to give the Blackfish a quick shout out and then give him a scene where he goes out kicking Frey ass and leave his rewrite at that. However, upon looking back at our rewrite so far, I realized I actually didn't properly delve into the fate of one particular house that plays a major role in the story. So therefore, in order to fill in the gaps of our rewrite and give the Blackfish a fitting end, we are going to make perhaps the riskiest change of this entire rewrite series. And I say risky because, while I do not believe this change will completely fuck up this entire rewrite, there is a chance that I may have overlooked something. If by the end of this episode any of you do notice a problem with the change we are to make, please let me know. Okay, I know I'm blueballing the fuck out of y'all, but I want to save all the details of our big change till the very end. In order to set the stage for our upcoming big ass change, we need to discuss one of the largest and most complex fan theories for the book series that has yet to come to fruition. A theory that has been given the name, the Grand Northern Conspiracy. Now, the original author's entire layout of the conspiracy is a massive 7-part series. I'll link it below. But allow me to just give you the skinny. Following the Red Wedding, the once prideful and banded together houses of the North are left in shambles. They have lost their king, a number of the most well-respected figures of their community, and they are currently being ruled by the very person who sold them out to the Lannisters, Roose Bolton. The theory states that, in the tradition of the popular phrase, the North remembers, that the northern houses may not be as ready to settle under Bolton rule as they seem, and that several high-ranking members of the northern houses are conspiring to rebel against Bolton rule and instill a Stark as the rightful ruler of the North. The leader of this rebellion is theorized to be Lord Wyman Manderly, head of House Manderly and fierce Stark loyalist, also the owner of the actual in-book nickname, Lord Too Fat to Sit on a Horse. Despite Wyman's feigned acceptance of Bolton rule, it is becoming extremely clear that Wyman is pulling strings behind the scenes to take the Boltons down, due to his loyalty to the Starks, as well as losing one of his sons during the Red Wedding. Supporting evidence includes the fact that Roose Bolton straight up doesn't trust Wyman at all, and is even paranoid that Lord Manderly is trying to poison him. The fact that 3 Frey guests that were traveling with Lord Manderly disappeared en route to Winterfell for the marriage of Arya Stark, aka Jane Poole. Strangely enough, Wyman arrives at the wedding with 3 massive pies that he serves to the wedding guests. Gee, I wonder what sort of pies they could be. And the fact that when Davos Seaworth travels to see Lord Manderly to enlist his men to backstance Baratheon, Lord Manderly fakes Davos' execution, openly informs him that he is feigning his loyalty to the Boltons and Frey, Freys and tasks him with finding and bringing to him Rickon Stark, who he has learned is still alive, in exchange for him supporting Stannis. So as you can see, it seems very clear that Lord Manderley is actively trying to retake the North from the Boltons and instill a Stark, possibly Rickon, or perhaps even Jon, considering as we discussed in his episode that he was most likely legitimized by Robb, as Warden of the North. Currently, Lord Manderley and his men are marching along with a part of the Frey army from Winterfell to confront Stannis Baratheon, who has been halted by a fierce storm on the outskirts of the castle. And if Lord Manderley is planning to take the Boltons down, then there is a chance that Lord Manderley will have his men defect just as the battle in the ice begins and join Stannis' forces. As for which other northern houses are also feigning their loyalty to the Freys and Boltons and are helping Lord Manderley with his prospective double cross, well, we really don't know at this point, but things will probably come to fruition in the Winds of Winter. Anyway, that was just a short rundown of the conspiracy and how it may come into play later in the book series. Now, why do I bring all this up? Well, for two reasons. The first is that it really shows the character and unification of the northern houses, something that I feel was sort of axed in the show. The northern houses following the Red Wedding are not only fractured, but, as we discussed in Sunday's episode, have really lost their will to fight. The Grand Northern Conspiracy is nowhere to be found in the show, and Lord Manderley is reduced to a pretty pitiful cameo when he gets pwned by Lyanna Mormont. Sort of a shame to see such a proud group of houses reduced to spineless bitches. And this gets even worse later in the show, where the northern houses seem to flip-flop all over the place just for the sake of drama. Like how they crowned Jon their king at the end of season 6, and then consider turning on him less than a season later after he put Sansa in charge and goes to meet with Dany. It just seemed weird to me in the show that the northern houses seemed to so easily just accept Bolton as their new leader as opposed to rebelling, which is why we tried to rectify that just a little bit in Sunday's episode. And number two, the conspiracy may hold the answer to one of the most pressing questions by the end of A Feast for Crows, which is, where the hell is the Blackfish? As I said before, in the show, the Blackfish is said to have been killed during his escape from Riverrun. A lot of fans thought that this was merely a ruse and that he would have popped up again later in the series, but sadly that was not the case. But in the book, the Blackfish successfully escapes from Riverrun and becomes a fugitive. Now, where would the Blackfish go? He obviously isn't going to hightail it for the Bahamas and enjoy a vacay. He most likely is on his way back to the north, and whether he is secretly working with Lord Manderley or has hooked up with the Brotherhood Without Banners, one of the more common theories, I think we can safely assume that he has one thing on his mind: to destroy the house of the man who betrayed and eviscerated his family, Roose Bolton. Many of you will note that I actually didn't disclose the fates of both Ramsay and Roose Bolton during Sansa's video, where we made our changes to the Battle of the Bastards. I assume many of you just assumed that Ramsay was killed by someone, maybe Jon or Sansa or Theon, once they took back Winterfell, and Roose dies in our rewrite the same way he does in the show, at the hands of Ramsay. Honestly, I don't really care who kills Ramsay for our rewrite scenario. Since we took out Sansa's assault at the hands of him, the Hound scene really wouldn't have as much of an impact. I'd say a nice public hanging at the hands of Jon on the Winterfell Square would be quite satisfying. However, I was absolutely livid with Roose's death. Judge me if you will, but I always loved Roose in both the book and in the show. As evil a motherfucker as he is, I gotta respect his pragmatism, and though the Red Wedding was horrifying, god damn did it take balls. He stands as one of my favorite villains of the series, and Michael Mickelhatton's steely portrayal of the character is top tier. But to have him just get shanked by Ramsay in season 6 was just so fucking stupid. All of a sudden, the writers give Ramsay daddy issues and allow him to take out one of the most towering villains of the show within the span of about 10 seconds? Why not just keep Roose alive until after the Battle of the Bastards and give Jon Sansa the satisfaction of killing the man who killed their mother and brother? Cause fuck you, that's why. So yeah, we could keep Roose alive and have him be killed alongside Ramsay by Jon Sansa. But you know who it would be infinitely more satisfying to see kill Roose? Brynden Mother Blackfish fucking Tully. To see the Blackfish get his much deserved vengeance on the man who betrayed his family would be the perfect conclusion to his character arc. Perhaps after he escapes from Riverrun, Brynden travels to the north and sneaks his way into Winterfell. While hiding in the castle, as sort of a nod to the Grand Northern Conspiracy, he begins to sabotage the Boltons any way he can, perhaps mainly by taking out some of Roose's higher ranking men, in turn making Roose devolve into a paranoid wreck. Once the Battle of the Bastards kicks off and it is clear that Jon Sansa will be successful in taking back Winterfell, the Blackfish reveals himself and takes his final revenge. A pretty sweet culmination for the Blackfish if you ask me. Unfortunately, this change is unable to be facilitated. The reason being that even if we do not kill off the Blackfish and have him successfully escape Riverrun, there is no way he could possibly make it to Winterfell in order to be there for the end of the Battle of the Bastards, since both of these events happen at roughly the same time at the end of season 6. Perhaps we could instill within the Blackfish the same Superman speed that that the writers gave to Gendry in season 7. But nah, we're not going to do that shit. So yeah, unfortunately because of this, there is no way the Blackfish can be at Winterfell to take his vengeance at the end of the Battle of the Bastards. And this sucks even harder since this is only a problem in the show and not in the book. See, in the show, following the death of Tywin at the end of season 4, Cersei sends Jaime to Dorne to retrieve Myrcella. She dies and he arrives back at King's Landing at the beginning of season 6. He is then sent by Cersei to settle the siege of Riverrun, which he does successfully at the end of the season. So for you show watchers, in case you didn't already know or simply suspected due to the piss poor writing of the Dorne plot, Jaime never ever goes to Dorne in the books. Ever. That shit never happens. In the book, after Tywin's death, Cersei sends Jaime to Riverrun right away. So if the showrunners had gone with this, Jaime would have settled the siege of Riverrun by the end of season 5, and thus the Blackfish would have had an entire season to get to Winterfell, fuck Roost's shit up, and be there at the end of the Battle of the Bastards. Now, why did the writers push back Jaime in the Riverlands an entire season? Well, it most likely has to do with the fact that they omitted a certain decrepit character who will play a large role in Jaime's upcoming character arc in the Winds of Winter. Because they removed this character, they didn't have anything for Jaime to do for a good chunk of time, and thus they came up with Weekend at Dorne starring Jaime and Bronn. Also, they omitted several characters from the Dorne arc in the book, so they needed some way to introduce the region in a more tied-in way, unfortunately. But in any case, with the show timeline as it stands, the Blackfish would not be able to get to Winterfell in time for the end of the Battle of the Bastards. Unless we do a little switcheroo. And here we go, y'all. The change that might potentially break this entire rewrite if there is something I am missing, but fuck it, I'm gonna do it anyway. We are going to take Jaime's season 5 arc and his season 6 arc, and we're gonna switch them. After Tywin's death at the end of season 4, Cersei sends Jaime to settle the siege of Riverrun. As we discussed in his episode, during this time, Jaime starts to grow detached from Cersei and starts to take back some of his agency, as demonstrated when he decides to refuse Cersei's wish to sack the castle and instead settles the siege peacefully. Jaime gets Edmure to turn over the castle to the Lannisters, but Edmure aids in the Blackfish's escape from Riverrun. Then our rewrite will have the Blackfish, off screen of course, travel north to Winterfell, where he will sneak into the castle and begin his guerrilla war against Roose Bolton. Jaime, meanwhile, returns to King's Landing from Riverrun to find Cersei broken after her Walk of Atonement. Now, while on the show he hangs around for a while before heading to Riverrun, we are going to have Jaime head straight for Dorne at Cersei's request. Cersei is fearful that her trial may not go in her favor and wants her surviving children, both Myrcella and Tommen, close by her. And thus, Jaime will head for Dorne probably in episodes 1 or 2 of season 6. He arrives and meets with Myrcella and Prince Doran. Now, we'll go into the full details of the changes we're going to make to the Dornish plot in its own video. I know I said I wasn't going to do it, but fuck it, it's getting done. Anyway, Jaime meets with Myrcella and tries to convince her to come back with him, but Myrcella rejects his plea, stating she wants to distance herself from her mother as she is hopelessly toxic. Though Jaime is eventually successful in getting Myrcella to come back to King's Landing with him, Myrcella pleads with Jaime to return to King's Landing, get Tommen, and the three of them can run off together, somewhere where Jaime can be a proper father to his children for the first time, away from the influence of Cersei. Though Jaime considers this plan is obviously cancelled upon Myrcella's death. Jaime returns to King's Landing sometime late in season 6 with Myrcella's body, which is what ultimately sends Cersei over the edge. And this is when she puts her plan of burning the Sept of Baelor into motion, which results in the deaths of her enemies, but also the death of her third and final child. And then season 7 plays out the same as it does as we discussed in Jaime's episode, with him making one last ditch effort to convince Cersei to give up her tirade of hatred before ultimately realizing she is a lost cause. So yeah, I was a bit paranoid about making such a radical change as it risked fucking a lot of shit up. But the more I look at it, I actually think the positives far outweigh the potential cons. First, Jaime going to the Riverlands first works well, as not only does it set up our ending for the Blackfish, but serves as the spark of Jaime's eventual denouncement of Cersei. By settling the siege of Riverrun peacefully, he realizes he is no longer a slave to Cersei's manipulative power. When he returns to King's Landing, he is given temporary pause upon seeing Cersei in such a vulnerable position, and thus he agrees with her request to bring Myrcella back to King's Landing. But after Myrcella finally opens Jaime's eyes to the fact that Cersei is a poison that he must rid himself of, he begins to use the spark he acquired in season 5 and considers actually leaving her. Following his return to King's Landing with Myrcella's body, Jaime pleads with Cersei to leave with Tommen and start a new life somewhere together. But instead, Cersei destroys the Sept of Baelor and her enemies, which in turn results in Tommen's death. What's great about this scenario for the rewrite is that Jaime will be in King's Landing when the Sept of Baelor blows up. Jaime will bear witness to his worst nightmare, the destruction of King's Landing and the death of hundreds of innocent civilians. The exact scenario he gave everything to prevent when he killed the Mad King. And to make matters worse, the woman he loves is the one who facilitated the act. Come season 7, Jaime is livid at Cersei for her obsession with revenge, and how that obsession took from him his final child. By the end of season 7, after Cersei cannot even put aside her hatred for a moment to fight the White Walkers, Jaime finally makes the decision to leave her. The only potential flaw in switching the plotlines, as I can see, is that in order for this to work, Jaime will have to travel to and return from Dorne within the span of about, say, 7 to 8 episodes. He will travel to Dorne in episode, say, 1 or 2 of season 6, and he would have to return by episode 9 at the absolute latest. Since Cersei discovering that Myrcella has been killed is in part what sends her over the edge and initiates her decision to destroy the Sept of Baelor. However, I guess we could make this work. Dorne isn't as far from KL as the radical change in setting makes it seem like it is. And if you rewatch season 5, I don't know why you would, you will see that Jaime dicks around in Dorne far longer than he has to. Just have Jaime get brought to Prince Doran and Myrcella right away, rather than fucking with the whole fight on the beach and disguises and all that shit. Have Myrcella and Jaime chill in Dorne for a couple episodes, and then have Jaime return with the dead Myrcella, again at the very latest episode 9. As for the other potential flaw, I do like how in the show the pacing of Cersei losing her children is spread out over the course of several seasons, with her losing Joffrey in season 4, Myrcella in season 5, and Tommen in season 6. Our rewrite scenario, however, would have Myrcella and Tommen dying perhaps within the span of 2 or 3 episodes. Not the best pacing, but again, I think the pros outweigh the cons. Okay, reminding myself this is a Blackfish episode. Let's rewind and talk about the changes to be made. So I would stick with the show and not have the Blackfish show up until season 3. No big changes for his role in season 3, outside of having him lay off Edmure a bit. I'd keep in the book's version of the funeral scene as well, to really highlight the Blackfish's empathetic side. Then we are going to switch Jaime's season 5 and season 6 plotlines. Thus, the Blackfish will escape Riverrun at the end of season 5 with the help of Edmure, as is what happens in the book. I also think this works as a semi-redemption for Edmure for his fuck up at the Stone Mill, as well as making him less of a completely limp dick little pussy. Following his escape, the Blackfish makes his way to Winterfell and sneaks into the castle, hiding out in the crypts most likely, and occasionally fucking Bolton shit up when he can. Roose obviously is not killed by Ramsay, and instead must deal with several unexplained deaths occurring throughout the castle, turning Roose into a nervous wreck, and making him paranoid that the Northerners who swore fealty to him are planning on betraying him. Roose starting to become unhinged due to unexplained murders at Winterfell is actually a repurposed plot from the books, but instead of the Blackfish, it's actually Mance Rayder and his spearwives doing the killing. Yeah, as stated, Mance is still alive in the books. It's complicated, maybe I'll discuss it another time. Meanwhile, Jon and Sansa, along with the Wildlings, Night's Watch, and Stannis' remaining men, per Stannis' episode, spend season 6 trying to gain the Northerners' support, but fail to do so. And thus, as Ramsay marches on Castle Black to snuff out Rick and Stark, who escape Winterfell with the help of Theon at the end of season 5, Sansa returns to the Eyrie, rallies the Knights of the Vale, and brings them to the Battle of the Bastards, leading to a Stark victory. And now on to our conclusion for the Blackfish. Following the arrival of the Knights of the Vale, Ramsay and a group of his men flee back to Winterfell as they do in the show, with Jon and Sansa and their forces all on his tail. Meanwhile, back at Winterfell, a scout arrives and tells Roose that the Knights of the Vale have arrived and defeated their Bolton forces. Realizing Jon and Sansa now have the support of Castle Black, the Wildlings, Stannis' forces, and now the Knights of the Vale, Roose knows he has no chance of holding Winterfell. In addition, given that he has been paranoid all season in fear that someone is planning to betray him, he fears the northern houses who pledge their loyalty to him will turn on him as soon as Jon and Sansa roll up to the front gates. With no options left, Roose decides to flee Winterfell at once by himself, with the intention of seeking solace at King's Landing. Remember, since our rewrite doesn't see Roose marrying Sansa to Ramsay, there is, at this point, no ill will between the Boltons and Lannisters. Roose and the scout run to Roose's chambers as Roose prepares to leave Winterfell for good. But as Roose is collecting his possessions, he hears his chamber doors shut and lock. He turns to find the scout, his throat slit, on the floor. And standing over the scout, a cloaked figure. Roose's men begin banging on the door, telling him to let them in, as Roose watches as the cloaked man removes his hood, revealing himself as the motherfucking Blackfish. He explains to Roose his numerous assassinations of Boltons and Freys throughout the castle over the last several months, wanting to inflict on him the same punishment he experienced at the Red Wedding. As the Blackfish approaches Roose, men desperately trying to break down the door, the Blackfish mentions that he overheard from a Frey what Roose said to Robb just before he killed him. And as the Blackfish Blackfish comes to Roose and grabs his collar, he states, "The Starks send their regards," and plunges the dagger into Roose's chest. Roose's men break the doors down, finding the Blackfish standing over Roose's dead body, and as they draw their swords, the Blackfish attacks, taking on a group of Bolton soldiers in a final blaze of glory. Later, Sansa and Jon find the Blackfish dead alongside Roose's body, and realizing he came back to avenge their mother and brother, gave their uncle a proper funeral. And that will wrap this episode of Game of Thrones Rewrite. Again, not the longest or most thorough episode, but given the Blackfish's rather limited role in the books and show, there wasn't a whole lot to talk about. Also, my final line for the Blackfish does seem pretty corny and fanfiction-y, but I feel like it's something the show writers would have probably pulled had they set up this scenario. Also, hearing Clive Russell deliver that line while gutting Roose like a fish, hell, corny as it may be, it would no doubt have sent shivers up my spine. Now, moving forward, the switching of Jaime's Season 5 and Season 6 plotlines will stand as rewrite canon, if you will. I've given Jaime and Cersei's videos a few rewatches to check to see if there are any major plot clashes made by making this switch, and I don't believe there are. However, if any of you bodacious ball lickers do find any discrepancies, let me know in the comments and I'll make sure to address them in a future video. Thanks again for joining me today. Subscribe if you haven't already, consider supporting me on Patreon, and tune in next episode as we discuss the trials and tribulations of Brienne of Tarth. Now, given the fact that Brienne was basically sent halfway across the fucking landmass of Westeros every other season, her rewrite will most likely be outlining the route path she takes in the show and adjusting it for a rewrite. But hopefully we can find some fun surprises along the way. Anyway, thanks again for your continued support, and I'll see you next time.